And now it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Brian Arthur for his talk on humans, disease, and wholeness. Now, Brian is Professor of Economics and Professor of Human Biology at Stanford, and he's the recipient of the Lagrange Prize in Complexity Science, which is known as Complexity's Nobel Prize. I think really that Brian is father of complexity theory, and we're very privileged to have him here. Apart from his impeccable academic credentials, and he is something of a polymath, he's also a very delightful person, and do take the chance of talking with him because he has a wealth of stories in the true Irish fashion, which are illuminating and a wonderful narrative. So I'm going to hand over now to Brian for his talk on humans, diseases, and wholeness. Thank you, Brian.
Good morning. Could I ask some of you who are on your cell phones to put them away and switch them off, please? Please?
Record.
Oh, recording. Okay. Anyway, good morning, and I'm delighted to be here. I was very intrigued by the talk last night from Mark Harrison, where he was telling us really the history of the whole idea of pandemics. And what I want to do is follow up, but rather than talk about pandemics, I'm going to be showing some of the effects of pandemics this morning, or epidemics, whatever you want to call them. I'm very aware that about half of this audience, or 2/3 of the audience, are real experts in this area, whether they're from China or from the West. And this is a huge area. What I want to do is to lay out some of the map here and talk about one way to look at the entire landscape rather than getting very technical about one particular area. So let me begin. My interest in this stems from something quite peculiar. I was told about the 1918 flu, but we didn't find out about this as children until I was very late in primary school, whereas both world wars were regularly mentioned and talked about and discussed on television. This is the First World War 100 years ago. This year it started, as you know. And it killed about 9.2 million people, men, in combat. The Second World War was pretty much a sort of follow-up to the First World War, when countries had time to rearm and get annoyed at each other in a renewed way. And that killed 15.9 million people directly in combat, plus quite a few others not directly in combat. If you add those two together, about 25 million people died in both world wars. And we know a lot about that. What we know less about is this. This is the 1918 flu that followed from the First World War. Mark said last night that somewhere between 25 million and 50 million people died. Nobody quite knows how many people died, but it was certainly more than both world wars combined. And yet, it wasn't the severest pandemic per person. It was the greatest single human catastrophe we've ever known, yet we don't talk about it. It's somewhat hidden, and yet it sort of hangs over us at the same time. Now, I was wondering, what is it about pandemics that, if they're in the past, we don't know that much about them. We don't talk about them quite so much. And as I was reading a lot about the 1918 flu literature, I realized that people died. And as you can see from the hospitals set up here. This is clearly military, where all the infected are separated very well. People wore masks. But the whole thing was very banal. It was very ordinary. Deaths that way are just people dying. There's nothing glorious about it. You could say there's nothing glorious either about dying in war, but war is a good story. Pandemics, when they happen, are squalid, and the deaths usually are every bit as bad as dying in war. This was not a good way to die. Not that many people died. I think about a quarter of the population got the 1918 flu, and it varied obviously from country to country. And of the people who got it, only about 2.5% died. But still, that was a lot of people. 25 million to 50 million is a lot of people. Things went on from there, and the 20th century was sort of pretty good. Conditions got better and better. By the 1970s, President Johnson in America was claiming that infectious diseases were no longer a threat. And then along came HIV/AIDS. I was in America then, and I remember a lot of puzzlement and bewilderment. Then we had SARS, as you remember, in China and elsewhere. And we have had various avian flus. We've had all kinds of things, hantavirus, Legionnaire's disease, Ebola, that we hadn't really anticipated. And many of you here are experts on that. But my observation is that there's a feeling that we're waiting. I live in California, and we definitely have a feeling in California we're waiting. We just mumble about waiting for the big one, but I'm not very far from the San Andreas Fault. I used to live in Berkeley, where the fault ran right under the building and the football stadium next to it where I was living. The San Andreas Fault is not very far away from Palo Alto, where I live. And we're waiting. Similarly with epidemics and pandemics. We've had a number of scares, as you know, and as I keep saying here, many people are expert on that in this room, yet we're waiting. One thing we can think about at least is what are the consequences if a pandemic arrives. And it's pretty clear to me that I'm an economist, and the consequences obviously are fairly clear economically. You can say, well, you can do this sort of as an exercise, give it to your grad students or something, and they'll come back and they'll say, well, most likely hospitals will be full, businesses will have to shut, factories will shut, schools may shut down, airlines may shut down, trade may stop, there'll be days lost, there'll be output lost, there'll be trade lost, etc., and you can do all the mathematics. And indeed, some of the figures I've seen for SARS, done by actually BioEra, underline that maybe about $30 billion was the cost of the SARS outbreak, if I got the figures right. So this is nothing trivial. There are major consequences if there is even quite a scare. And as we were told last night, only 9,000 people died. Not good for them, but not an enormous thing when it comes to pandemics. What if we got hit by a larger one? Well, again, you could talk about days lost and factories closed and so on, but I think something much bigger would happen. I was thinking about this, and I need both hands, so I'll put this down. I view the economy for these purposes as something like a big inverted pyramid. At the top of the pyramid are all the activities and all the things that get done in businesses and schools, all the flights that airlines run and so on. Those are the activities we see in the economy. Certainly those would be affected. But I believe that if we had a worse pandemic than SARS, much worse, something like the 1918 flu, or God forbid, something like the bubonic plague that spread across the world in the 1300s, disruptions would be far more deep. So at the top of this pyramid are all the business activities, the organizational activities, and just below that, and in this inverted pyramid, are organizations. Things like the army, maybe the way churches are organized, labor unions, these larger organizations. They comprise the next deeper layer of the economy. Below that, again, we have institutions, the legal system, the way the police works, the way traffic works, all these institutions that help the economy run. Below that, again, we have social arrangements. How do we organize ourselves as a society? It's quite different in China from here in Scotland, or indeed in the US. Below that, again, the social arrangements, we have the whole mindset of the economy. The point I want to make is the bigger the disruption, the bigger the pandemic, the deeper it goes into this pyramid. So I was thinking about the 1918 flu from that viewpoint. The 1918 flu got as far as disrupting the major organizations. Parts of the armies, both in Germany and in America and in France, where they were fighting, the Western Front and the Eastern Front, had to close down. They couldn't put enough of certain regiments together, battalions, and so they had to hold off on certain army movements. That affected the organization. It didn't go quite as deep as affecting the social arrangements. So for that, I started to look at the Bubonic Plague. The Bubonic Plague is incredibly interesting if you like horror stories. People think, and these are admittedly Western scholars, but many Chinese scholars as well, think it originated in China around 1331. It made its way along the trade routes along the Silk Road, arrived in Crimea Peninsula, and then headed by ship west into the Mediterranean and into Europe. A lot of people died in all these countries. The records, I don't know. In China, they're probably very well kept. But in the West, we know that something like, some staggering figure, like 25% or 30% of people died. This is a huge number of people. It's still not the biggest catastrophe in sheer numbers, but in sheer percentages, this is huge. And again, people died not in a very pretty way, usually. The bubonic plague, or the Black Death, as it was called in Europe, was severe enough that whole populations didn't recover for 100 to 150 to 200 years. If I put on my demographer's hat, what I could tell you is that that meant a lot of children were wiped out. If the children weren't wiped out, by the way, these pandemics or epidemics differentially affect age groups. Sometimes they hit old people, sometimes they hit the middle layer. This all depends on immunities. Sometimes it also hits children. The Black Death or bubonic plague in the 1300s must have hit the children very severely, because that wipes out the potential for population for the next generation, and the one after that, and the one after that. So it did take 100 to 200 years for most countries to recover. We don't know the data very well, but this was a major disruption. I'll give you the story here in, I shouldn't say here in England, we're in Scotland, but here in the UK, and as it applies to England. And again, this is gleaned from many sources. All of this is in some dispute. But the population was badly enough affected in England that the social arrangements went into quite a bit of upheaval. It was recorded at the time that there weren't enough men to plow the fields. Some villages were almost wiped out, others were left relatively untouched. But furrows weren't plowed. Animals went in the fields without being fed. Animals died. People died, and there was general scarcity of peasants, serfs. There was a general scarcity of the people at the bottom of society in those days. Of course, people higher up died as well. But this was enough, according to many scholars, to be a major contributing factor to the end of feudalism. Now, that one statement's under some dispute, and I'm not saying that history always has one cause. I'm pointing out that if a pandemic is bad enough, it can affect the very social arrangements that are made. It also caused something else. It caused shock and bewilderment. I think this is an even bigger effect. On the surface, it doesn't sound like much, but what I'm talking about is real fear. Fear was bad enough that I remember, and I shouldn't say I remember, I may be old, but I'm not that old. But I remember from studying this quite a ways back that there were people who recorded what happened at the time. Boccaccio was one of them, the Italian author. In England, there were cases where families were sick and the authorities, for good or bad, walled them into their houses so they couldn't get out. They were left there to die. I don't think these stories are prevalent, and they're not exaggerated. These are recorded. Sometimes corpses and families were just dragged out because people didn't dare to touch them and left to be picked up. There weren't enough grave diggers. People didn't want to dig graves and have to deal with corpses. There weren't people to do the church blessings over the corpses, and in general, people were scared. There was also a counter-reaction. The counter-reaction was, well, if we're all going to die and we're all going to go to hell anyway, we may as well have a good time. So I want to read you a quote here. And the quote here is, "A lawless extravagance that owed its origins to the plague." In other words, for lawless extravagance, read that people went a bit wild. This is like a social party that got out of control. Some people sequestered themselves, disappeared, went into seclusion, trying to survive. Other people just said, what the hell, let's just go for it. It was settled that present enjoyment and all that contributed to it was both honorable and useful. What's interesting about that statement, this can be said of the plague, by the way. It can be said of subsequent waves of the plague that kept coming to the 1600s. But what's interesting about this is the date. This is Thucydides in 1431 BC. So this was a plague that happened in Greece. That's the man there. And obviously he survived it. But what I want to point out is that if the disruption is deep enough, it goes right into the social fabric, into the mentality of people. So it's not just, this is not days lost in production and in picking grapes in Greece. This is the whole institutions of the society and the very way it thinks getting disrupted. And we have seen this again and again and again. Fear predominates. And it's a sort of strange fear. It's not just fear that you'll die. It's a fear that comes from not knowing when this thing's going to hit you or your family and not knowing where it's coming from. Here's an image that keeps cropping up in the plague. I'm sure Mark has seen this dozens of times. And I think it's a bit exaggerated. You keep finding this. This particular drawing was done, I think, much later, 1654, by some German artist, and it's called Herr Dr. Schnabel from Rome. So Dr. Beek of Rome. And it's a bit of a caricature. Some of it's in Latin and some of it's in German. But the point is that, at least in Italy, many of the doctors were so frightened, these are the physicians, that they wouldn't go into the hospitals. They very often sent the surgeons into the hospitals. Surgeons were a lower order of life. They're the ones that let blood. They're the ones that cut off limbs. They were not high up at that time. They were sent into the hospitals, and the doctors shouted instructions from outside the windows. They wore these apparatuses. I don't know if they thought they were beautiful or not, but at that time the belief was that the infection was coming from miasmas, possibly in English, I don't know. Miasmas, thank you. My English has been ruined from 4 decades in America. So people thought these were, pardon to the Americans here. But there was a general agreement that the infections were sort of coming from swamps and from general contagion and from rotting corpses of bodies and animals and so on. So the physicians at that time would put roses into the beak so that they could breathe pure air. Again, the point is that not so much that there's fear. Obviously there's fear. There's a bewilderment. Where does this come from? Why is it hitting us? Who's behind it? And this is where the church took a real hammering all over Europe. What sort of God was this that he could wipe out whole families? What are people thinking of? We've lost our families. We prayed hard, that had no effect. So people stopped believing so much in religion, and there's been a lot of scholarly ink spilled over whether that contributed to the Reformation. My guess is it definitely weakened the church in Europe and left it open to Reformation in the 1500s, about 150, 200 years later. Then I began to wonder, well, that was all in the past, 1300s, 1500s, 1600s. We are much smarter these days, and we're much more sophisticated, so we're not going to get into shock and bewilderment, are we? But I was living in America through September 11, 2001, and I can tell you, again, go to the figures, about 3,000 people killed. And I don't want to make light of that, that's very serious. But that's approximately equivalent to the number of people killed on the roads in America in a month. Yet we don't talk about people being killed on the roads in a month. So what is really going on here? Shock, bewilderment, and fear. Where is this coming from? Why are they doing this to us? What have we done to deserve this? When is it going to hit next? Time magazine ran a front cover that said, why do they hate us? It was just a question. That has hovered over America ever since. So this one tiny disruption, now again, I don't want to make light of it, but I'm talking in terms of sheer numbers of people killed. This one small disruption was so severe in its shock, it got right down to the social fabric of the United States, and we have been in fear since, and we have an enormously elaborate set of organizations now to deal with that. I say this, by the way, as someone coming from Northern Ireland. I went through enough of the troubles there that I can tell you You'd hear a bomb go off maybe 3 miles away. You'd be watching television. Bomb would go off and say, boom. Say, wow, that was pretty close. And who do you think it was? I don't know. And then 5 minutes later, you'd make a cup of tea. That is because we were immunized or immune almost to that violence. That violence was not pretty. And people did live in fear. But it wasn't shock. And we knew where it was coming from. So the big effect of a pandemic, if it hit us, would be awe and bewilderment. Why us? Why now? What have we done? I want to move on. One thing I want to say is that in the art of the time, in the 1600s, 1400s, you'd often see an image of a woman crossing a river at night in a boat, coming into the town. She would be, this was death, and she would be dressed in a cloak and faceless. So death would slip into a city, dressed in a cloak, cross the river, come into the city, people would die. Everything was unknown. What we now know, I want to talk about where these diseases actually come from, or where pandemics come from, what is known. What we do know, as Mark Harrison told us last night, is that a lot of, about 60%, close to 2/3 of diseases are humans in contact with animals. Animals carry microorganisms. That's the things on the right. I think the one on the right is actually an artist's rendition of H5N1. Somebody in the audience might know enough to correct me if that's wrong. But what happens is that wild populations of animals, in this case birds in this illustration, carry all kinds of bacteria, viruses, and so on. And these are mixing. So in a typical story, and this is one that comes from Steve Aldrich, when we were chatting, a very typical story would be that there are many species of birds flocking in the Arctic, in Siberia, say. And they're flocking there in the summer, laying eggs. They're all wading around on the same ground, sharing the same diseases, and microorganisms pass through species very quickly. Then they fly down, in this case, say to China, to Guangdong province, where they come in contact with domesticated animals, sometimes, in this case, herds of poultry, if you can call them herds, flocks of poultry, whatever poultry are, collectively. A misery of poultry, I don't know what it would be. And sometimes farm animals, herds of cattle and pigs. And these diseases are passed around. Think of these flocks and different species as reservoirs. And then from there, possibly crossing over to people. So a zoonosis is an animal infection or pathogens that are endemic in animals crossing over to other animals or to humans. And of course, things can go in different directions. The poultry, the industrially farmed poultry can pass microorganisms to the wild species. Humans have passed diseases to animals in the past. So what I want to point out is this is a very large, very complicated system of many, many species, many individuals and different species of animals, some industrial, some wild, some of the animals we call humans. And this system is huge, it's changing, it's interacting, and everything in it is co-adapting. Everything is adapting to everything else. One of the things that shocked me when I started to study biology was that humans adapt very rapidly. when syphilis came in, at least to Western Europe, it killed people within 3 weeks. It was about 3 weeks if you got syphilis, then you were dead. In the intervening time, by the way, the cure for syphilis, and this was early on, this would be 13, 14, 1500s, you were brought into a chamber where mercury vapor had been heated and was in the air, and this did away with the pox that you had. Same cure for smallpox, by the way. But that was because your skin started to rot and you started to smell like a corpse. I'm very sorry, by the way, if this is more like a horror movie than a talk. But what interests me is that people died when syphilis first arrived in the West. Now you could have syphilis in the West for maybe 20, 30, 40 years. People like Nietzsche had that, Winston Churchill's father, and you could live for several decades. And probably now in the 21st century, you'd be okay. That's not just because of modern medicine. It's because our ancestors who got syphilis died. And we're all descendants of people who survived syphilis, who survived the bubonic plague, who had resistance and passed those resistances down the generations. So everything is adapting and co-adapting. Now, one thing Mark mentioned last night is that there's a lot of human intervention. Obviously, humans are pushing this system. So again, think of this big system of wild animals, domesticated creatures, human beings, and what we might loosely call microbes, microorganisms, viruses, different bacteria, and so on. By moving, and this is very, very rapid in human history, by moving into cities and megacities, we have now moved human beings so that we are all pushed together, infecting each other or passing on different microorganisms very rapidly. We have an airline system, as was pointed out last night, and a shipping system to ship these microorganisms very rapidly. Another way this is being affected is by pushing into the wild, or what was previously the wild, deforestation. So we're coming in contact with new creatures or species that we hadn't encountered that much before. I believe this is how Ebola has been transmitted, that in this case from gorillas to human beings. We're pushing into habitats and we're pressing on those habitats. There's climate change, and that's putting many habitats under severe stress and changing the system very rapidly and changing the animals we're coming in contact with. And as you well know, antibiotics are producing strains of bacteria and viruses that are relatively immune to those antibiotics. So you can think of that as giving us new microorganisms that we need to worry about. What I want to point out is, and this is my own, closer to my own area, is that if you start to break all this out geographically, so if all this starts, if you start to plot the links, you might get some picture like this. This is a complex system. It's a system of many, many elements. You could think of these elements as species, species of microbes, species of viruses, if you like, different species of animals. Somewhere in the middle of all of this would be human beings, etc. And you could plot all this geographically. It's a complex system. Now, I want to pause and talk about this for a moment or two. A complex system is not called complex because it's complicated. There are many complicated systems. For example, a car engine is complicated, but it's not known as a complex system. What's different about a complex system is that the elements that are interacting in a complex system are mutually adjusting to each other. So in this big system of diseases and different species and human beings and microorganisms, everything is adjusting to everything else. And this is classically a complex system. There are certain properties we know about in complex systems. And there are many things that could be said here, but I want to point out 4 properties that concern me. When a system is complex, usually, in fact, all the cases I know of, it's non-linear. And that generally means that you can make small changes and more small changes and more small changes and nothing happens. And then you make a further small change and suddenly you tumble into a new basin and there's a large change. So just because everything's been going all right doesn't mean it's going to go all right forever. And I think we were getting a lot of these small changes from the 1918, 1919 era up until about 1980. Yes, there were a few epidemics and so on. I don't want to diminish those, but they were rather cause small shifts. We could get a large shift at any time, and many people here are very, very aware of that. Secondly, complex systems do not usually settle down. They're always discovering new behavior. And this is a bit of a shocker for Western science. In Western science, we tend to think of everything at equilibrium. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Thirdly, you get sudden breakouts. So nothing, 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 and then maybe some linkage gets cut in the system, or some resource disappears, or something changes, and then one of the populations starts to take off. And this is true. Sometimes forests come under stress. I remember in Santa Fe quite recently, it was about 5 years ago, with climate change, the local forests were coming under severe stress. There was drought, so the trees came under stress, and suddenly there was a huge population or invasion of tent moths eating the trees, and the trees, of course, died. Typical in a complex system. And you might think, well, that doesn't affect us. But the story, I think, of the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s on into the 20th century is that as human beings here in the West and, of course, in Asia in due course, we cut the linkage between us and microorganisms. We put in sewage systems that worked, and we put in clean water. The result was the population of human beings took off. All of this is great. If it hadn't, most of us wouldn't be here. But that was also a sudden breakout. And that's a historical one, and that's why we have 7 billion people at the moment. The other thing I want to point out is that in systems like this, very often if you have an intelligent population, let's say it's human beings, but it could be other creatures as well, if they do quite well in the system, they tend to elaborate around themselves. They start to organize resources in the system to their benefit. That gives you a more and more complicated system that surrounds that particular species. We call that civilization, but it's really a set of arrangements and a set of other species that are supporting us. If something happens to some of those subsystems, then the system that organized the whole thing can also collapse. So we could collapse if our economy collapsed, or if society collapsed, or if the social arrangements collapsed. So these are lessons. It's not that complex systems have the answer here. Complex systems are ones in which people, if you're in a complex system, you don't know what's going to happen next. And so one lesson I'm drawing from all of this is that what we have with human beings in the last 200 years, modernization, whether it's in China or Asia or the US or Europe, is a huge experiment. we will not know how it turns out. Another point I want to make about this is very much our bias in the West is to think of systems, any system that we're in, as kind of machine-like. This interacts with that, that interacts with this. And if we just get it tuned properly and adjusted properly, everything will be perfect. And if it's a bit out of equilibrium or out of whack, we can push it back into equilibrium and make it, if not perfect, pretty close to perfect, like the way your car runs. This is not a complex system. Complex systems are starting to teach us that we are part of a larger system that is always changing, always discovering new behaviors. And strange to say, we are discovering as Western scientists looking at these systems that are non-linear, non-equilibrium, always producing new things. The scientists who look at that are very aware that there is a philosophical system that has thought of that before us. And this is Chinese philosophy. And I want to just point out, and this is going to be fairly fast, Nancy, I want to point out that this comes from, obviously, China. The whole idea in China, and I'm here going into 2,500 years worth of thinking, probably closer to 5,000, 10,000 years of thinking in the East, is that we are not that important. We are members of a system that's always changing, that never settles down. And our job is to understand that system as best we can, and understand that we're changing within a larger system, and we're adapting appropriately to that as best we can. Our idea of harmony in the West is that everything is in equilibrium, everything's ordered, everything's under control, it will all be fine. And if something goes out, we can sort of push it back in. The Chinese idea of harmony, I won't attempt to pronounce it. The Chinese idea of harmony is very different from the Western idea of harmony. The Chinese idea of harmony is more like riding a bicycle. You're on your bicycle, the bicycle's moving, you're tending to fall in this direction, so you make a correction in that direction. Or you might be in a marriage, and if the marriage is harmonious, it's always changing. And you're always adapting, and the other person's always adapting, the family's always adapting, and you're just getting along, and you're adapting. So lastly, what I want to say about this, and this is sort of what lessons are we learning from, if you like, from systems theory, or complexity theory, or from modern scientific thinking about all of this, which many of you in the room are part of, or for that matter, from Chinese ancient thinking, and we're about to hear some more of this. What lessons can we learn? I want to just finish with one lesson. The lesson I want to finish with is that what we need is to, in my opinion, what we need is to be very aware that we are part of a large system. We are only one species among many, 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 many species, all changing, all adapting. What we need is not arrogance. It's not the idea that we need to control everything. We can't control everything. What we need, in one word, I believe, is respect. We need to respect nature and respect this larger, changing, adapting system that we are in. And there's a word that came to mind when I was preparing this, and that was that we are part of a whole system. We are part of a larger system that's a whole, and that's also a very Chinese way to look at it. And this whole system is what we need to respect. That we are small players in a much larger play, and we will do very well if we can understand what we're in and adapt as we go along. But we're never going to control the whole thing, nor should we. The last point I want to make is that the word wholeness, which figures here, and figures in Chinese thought, and figures in thinking about complex systems, that word whole is where the word health comes from. Health, to heal, means to make whole. So it means that somebody has got something lacking or missing, or parts that are out of balance, and the whole system of a human being is made whole. So that's health and wholeness. What we need to do is to try to make the larger system we're in, as well as us human beings, whole again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brian, for a masterly presentation. I mean, Brian has presented us with some terrifying facts, but he's done it in a way that, with such lightness of touch, that somehow we can assimilate the awfulness of the situation and follow his argument, which is very compelling. And also you've brought out, Brian, that the threat is both symbolic and real. It's a double whammy, because it becomes the vehicle for projections, you know, the sinister shadow aspect of the psyche, and fuel for social paranoia. And yet it's real. It's real, as you've demonstrated with the figures of the pandemics and the mortality. And that has to be confronted. And my closing thought on this is that does the harmony, riding the bicycle, this is a question, allow for us as a species to be 7.5 billion on our bicycles? Or is Gaia, is the world in its wisdom planning to reduce this population? I mean, these are enormous questions, and we're going to be looking at it through the course of the conference. So thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation.